Undoubtedly, you have already heard a ton about the upcoming NATO summit at The Hague, scheduled to begin just a few days from now. However, if I were a betting man, I would guess that the vast majority of what you have heard has been geared toward the 5% of GDP spent on defense, which will be the new target presumably coming out of the summit. But that is unlikely to be the only thing on the agenda. Indeed, there are some quiet conversations about what's going to happen at the summit as it relates to U.S. troop deployments in Europe. And that question has become all the more prominent over the last few days, as it seems that the United States might be geared up for a conflict in Iran, which would strain U.S. resources elsewhere around the world. Well, fortunately for me, last week I sat down with Brad Smith, a professor at Vanderbilt University, and someone that we have heard from previously, to talk about what happens with U.S. troop deployments around the world and what might happen when they leave. Bear in mind that this conversation took place before anything happened in Iran, though in the days since, the conversation has only become more important. I began by asking Brad to give us a broad overview of the various benefits that a country receives by having U.S. troops on its soil.
Yeah, so when I think about the benefits of deploying troops for a country like the United States, I think you can place them into four categories. First, you have the actual benefits of having the troops there and working with the partner country's troops, right? So we talked about this a little bit in our last conversation. The second category that you can think about here is the political benefits. So I'd think about these political benefits as being mostly about persuasion, both persuading political elites, so that's politicians and military officials in the host country, but also public opinion, turning the public opinion in favor of the United States. The third category is something that viewers of your channel will be familiar with, which is the tripwire effect, right? So this is the idea that by having troops stationed in these countries, that allows the U.S. to more firmly commit to get involved if an attack occurred, because it might harm one of the U.S. troops, which would make it much more likely that the United States would become involved. The fourth is one that comes up a lot in my own research, which is the idea of signaling. And I'll get more into this, but the basic idea is that by shouldering these costs of having those troops deployed in these partner countries, the U.S. demonstrates that it is actually serious about the defense of these partners to an adversary like Russia.
Why don't we start off by going into a little bit more depth about the actual military benefit part? It's straightforward, on one hand, to think that if a protege state has more men and materiel from the patron state, that it's going to be easier for the protege to resist an attack from an enemy. Straightforward. But there's probably some non-obvious implications there as well. So where exactly are those benefits coming from? And are there some non-obvious ways that benefits can be gained or lost depending upon whether you have the patron sending that men and materiel over there?
In terms of the non-obvious effects, I'd place them into two categories. One that you can think about being effects that occur in peacetime, and then another that you can think about effects that occur during a time of war. So let's talk about peacetime first. During our last conversation, we discussed the idea of interoperability. So interoperability is the process through which the U.S. or any senior alliance partner and their protege try to become more effective at fighting together on the battlefield. And as we discussed in our last conversation, this is a big change that's occurred with the way that alliances work now versus in the 19th century, right? So the idea with alliances now is that if one member is attacked, and especially NATO operates in this way, if one member is attacked, the expectation is that all of the members will be fighting on the battlefield alongside one another. And so going back to our last conversation, this requires the allies to do a lot of work together. These joint exercises are things that NATO is constantly doing, and they pay real dividends in terms of making the process of fighting together much smoother, in terms of technology, military training, doctrine, all kinds of things like that. When the U.S. is working to achieve interoperability with its partners, this is obviously a very lengthy and time-consuming process. And the issue with a troop withdrawal is that it doesn't just hit the pause button. The partner is going to possibly regress because they're not working actively with the U.S. to update their systems and training to be able to fight effectively if a war did occur.
So implicitly what you're saying here is that the decision that the Trump administration makes in the upcoming month and then the months thereafter, so from the NATO summit and then the military strategizing that's going to happen after that, it's going to have a long-lasting effect well beyond perhaps when the Trump administration comes to an end.
Exactly. It's obviously difficult to predict what would happen and how the other partners in NATO would respond, but certainly the lack of U.S. presence would be felt, and the partners would lose access to a lot of the resources and training that the U.S. does provide now.
And then the other half that you were talking about was the bad war effects, not the issues with the peacetime stuff, but what happens when you're actually on the battlefield.
Yeah, this is easy to understand if you just compare what a war would look like with U.S. troops deployed to what it might look like when the U.S. has withdrawn troops. So when the U.S. has troops there, they're there. They can get to the battlefield really quickly. But, of course, there's the Atlantic Ocean that separates the United States from Europe, and that takes quite some time to get across. And so you can see how this would hold the U.S.'s ability to get to the battlefield quickly up and potentially undermine their ability to defend the partners.
Well, how does that actually play out in terms of the sequencing of a war?
There's two effects. So the first one is that you have to recapture territory that you've lost. So if the U.S. isn't there at the start, the partner is probably going to be less able to defend territory. And so when the U.S. shows up, we're going to have to help them recapture territory that may not have been lost if the U.S. had been there to begin with. And following on from that, the U.S. would also face the difficulty of likely having to retake the initiative, where if they're not there and the opponent is on the offensive, it's much more difficult to turn an offensive war into a static war, into a hopefully offensive war in your direction, than it is to stop the opponent from seizing the initiative in the first place.
Okay, let's move on to that second category, which I think you described as public opinion and persuasion, which is probably an important one right now, given that opinions about the United States from U.S. allies have taken quite a turn in the last few months. And I suspect what you were about to tell me is that there would be deeper problems with this beyond just having a bad headline that says the United States is withdrawing some of its troops from Europe.
When I think about this persuasion effect, it occurs at two levels. One is public opinion, and so we can think about the mass public, voters, effectively. The other level that it occurs at is among political elites. So you can think of this as elected officials, but also military officers. So let me go through those in turn. In terms of public opinion, there's been a good bit of research that studies the effect of U.S. troop deployments on host country public opinion towards the U.S. What this research finds is that the effects are not unambiguously positive, but that the U.S. does a lot to make sure that on net, the troop deployments do result in an increase in public sentiment towards the U.S. Let me talk about these positives and negatives. On the positive side, troop deployments tend to increase public support for the U.S. because these bases that the U.S. builds and houses many troops and their families in do contribute to economic prosperity, typically in the places that they are built at. On the negative side, though, you can think of these bases as being effectively a city that springs up out of nowhere, and when you have lots of people moving into an area, inevitably there's going to be, unfortunately, some amount of crime. And when this comes into contact with the local population, for obvious reasons, it can contribute to a decrease in public support for the U.S. When you think about both these positive and negatives, the question is, on net, when you balance those two things out, is the effect positive on public opinion towards the U.S.? The answer is complicated, and I would turn interested listeners to a book called Beyond the Wire by Michael Allen, Michael Flynn, Carla Martinez-Machane, and Andrew Stravers. They talk about the variation in how these forces balance out, but sort of the punchline is that the U.S. invests a lot of effort in making sure that the effect is on net positive when they can. And so when we think about this, tying this back to the other big issue that NATO's confronting right now with the request for the 5% contribution, the countries that are going to be contributing potentially, if they view this as an initiative that's driven by the U.S. and this is something the U.S. wants to achieve, it's probably advantageous to have positive sentiment towards the U.S. So this may actually undermine that other goal that the U.S. is pursuing at this time.
I think the listeners will be very pleased to hear that there exists other books about war that I have not written. But why don't we pivot now to the discussion about the elite benefits rather than the public opinion benefits?
Definitely. So the elite benefits is a little bit more nebulous. There hasn't been as much research on this, but it is something that came up in some of the research that I did for a forthcoming book of my own, in the interest of there being books that weren't written by you about war.
Yeah, that will definitely be another episode, but let's try to keep these things one at a time.
Well, that book should be out at the end of the year, and I'd be happy to come back on and talk about it. So one thing that my co-author Brett Benson and I learned in the course of doing research for that book is that U.S. military officers can often achieve inadvertently some of the goals that State Department officials are trying to achieve when they're working alongside military officials from partner countries. One thing that came up in our interviews was the idea that when State Department officials travel to one of the partner countries, the air in the room is just different. The politicians they're meeting with sort of understand that this is a political conversation. Everyone's speaking politics speak. The air is not relaxed, and it in some situations can be a little bit more difficult for those meetings to be productive for sort of all of the reasons that your listeners will be familiar with, all these pathologies of politics and persuasion. One thing that we heard over and over again from U.S. military officials is that when they're working with military officers from partner countries, there's often a shared goal. And then sort of at the end of the day, the kinds of conversations that they'll have over a beer, for example, can be a little bit more relaxed and honest. And there was a lot of speculation from the people that we interviewed that these conversations can actually indirectly lead to political influence because politicians in the host country, they often care about what military officers, their own military officers, think. And if those military officers come to understand the perspective of U.S. officers, this can serve to positively influence things in the way that the U.S. would like.
And if I can jump in my own personal experience, that's also how I felt. It's a lot easier for me in my job to be able to convince a person inside of the Department of Defense or someone in the military, broadly speaking, whether it's the United States or otherwise, versus trying to talk to someone who is in the State Department or a foreign ministry office. Those people are much more focused on the political goals, whereas the DoD and various defense departments and ministries are more focused on just winning the day, so to speak. So it's a lot easier for me to convince them as well.
Right. Your experience is consistent with what we heard in our interviews. This is something that I'm really interested in looking into more. I don't know all of the mechanisms through which this influence might operate. It's also not clear to me how aware the State Department or DoD are of this. Certainly there are individuals that we've spoken to, but in terms of institutionalized leveraging of this kind of influence, I don't know the degree to which that's happening, and stay tuned.
Yeah, it's just so weird. That's not something I ever would have guessed when I entered this position many, many years ago. And it took me, I would say, a year or so to actually internalize the fact that I was getting through to the defense people much more easily than the state people. But why don't we actually transition now to that third topic you mentioned at the top, which was tripwire effects. And I think we can be relatively quick with this one because, as you mentioned, this is the type of thing that longtime listeners are very familiar with.
Yeah, so the tripwire effect is there to enhance deterrence. The idea, as your viewers will be familiar with, is that the presence of U.S. troops serves to draw the U.S. in if a war were to happen, because you can imagine that if an attack occurs on a country where there are lots of U.S. troops stationed, it's more likely that a member of the U.S. military might be injured or killed, and this would serve to draw the U.S. in. The effect that this has is that the enemy recognizes that this is likely to occur. They view the presence of U.S. troops as a tripwire that they don't want to step on, and they therefore stand far back. A classic example of this is Berlin during the Cold War, where you had U.S. and Soviet troops stationed really close to each other, and this served as a tripwire to prevent hostility that might spiral out of control.
Right, and this is still something that's relevant for NATO. If you think about what happened in the aftermath of the 2014 annexation of Crimea, NATO's main military response to that was to have the enhanced forward presence in the eastern parts of the NATO flanks. This was a program designed to have U.S. troops and other parts of the NATO alliance from the western side of Europe be stationed over in the eastern side of Europe precisely for this. And then there was a second iteration of this in 2022. And anyone who has been with me on the entire ride since I pivoted what I do online to being about conflict and not straight game theory, you guys will remember that the first thing that I published on was the troop deployments that Biden had sent out to Poland and Romania, which were relatively small right after the invasion began, because the point of those was not to actually be able to militarily fight back against Russia. It was to be able to convince Russia to not try to do anything in Poland or Romania.
So if I can jump in, I have a question for you about a contrast between these two cases in which we're thinking about the tripwire effect in. So in Berlin, U.S. and Soviet troops were right up next to each other in a small area, right? So you can think about these famous pictures of Checkpoint Charlie with U.S. and Soviet tanks literally feet away from each other. And that contrasts with this case of Ukraine, where you have a very long border where troops are not squished up against each other in the same way. So does that make it more difficult for the tripwire effect to work in that second context, or is there something I'm missing?
Well, how the turntables. The interviewer becomes the interviewee. I think that is something that is concerning to some degree among NATO officials, but one thing to keep in mind is that the number of plausible locations from which Russia could try to invade a NATO country, those are relatively few. Now, could Russian troops go elsewhere? Yeah, sure, but to some degree, that means that the tripwire force is actually having the effect. If having U.S. soldiers stationed in the obvious place to attack, or British or German or Canadian soldiers, there's a bunch of others that are doing these sorts of tripwire forces, if they are forcing Russia to go elsewhere, that means that Russia is invading in a more inconvenient place. Consequently, you would imagine that if Russia is attacking in a less advantageous position from the Russian perspective, then the NATO state would be better able to fight back and perhaps also stall for time to make sure that the rest of the NATO forces can get there and halt the Russian offensive. So yes, to some degree, any sort of tripwire force is going to have this problem of needing to have a whole bunch of humans across a very long line to be able to guarantee that there will be some sort of life lost by the tripwire force in the event of an invasion. But perhaps that ultimately is not the goal of having a tripwire force along the eastern flank. Why don't we move on to the fourth and final topic, which is the signaling effects of these troop deployments. That it's telling something to Russia that the absence of a troop deployment would not be communicating.
Right, and I think that's a good way of distinguishing between these two mechanisms through which an alliance can achieve deterrence. So the tripwire effect is one where we think about deterrence being achieved under complete information, where everyone knows the tripwire is there, we all see it, no one has any uncertainty about its presence or the consequences of stepping on it. Now that contrasts with this signaling logic that I want to talk about now. The key issue in this signaling logic is that Russia is uncertain about what the United States might do if a NATO member was attacked.
And just to be clear, this is a hypothetical Russia that is uncertain about U.S. credibility. This isn't a statement about whether we know whether Russia knows or not that, right?
Precisely. So the position that this puts the U.S. in is to successfully deter Russia, the U.S. needs to take some kind of action that shapes Russia's beliefs. Well, how does the U.S. do this? One way is by shouldering costs that demonstrate that the U.S. is serious, and one way to shoulder those costs is to take on the cost of maintaining these troop deployments, which are quite expensive.
This is basically the manifestation of don't listen to what leaders say, watch what they do, and specifically pay the costs associated with those sorts of deployments, which are expensive and not free, like saying things like, we're going to defend them, trust me.
Exactly. It's the idea, like you said, that actions sort of speak louder than words. So we can think about why this works if we contrast statements that the U.S. might make with actions that they could take. So if you think about a statement that the U.S. might make to the effect of, we will defend the partner, well, there's nothing that stops the U.S. from saying that. It's completely costless. Literally, it just doesn't take any money to say that. Now let's contrast that with what it takes to deploy and maintain those troop deployments. That requires repeated investment and effort, And what makes that different from simple talk is that the U.S., presumably, in Russia's mind, is only going to be willing to do that if they actually care a lot about the defense of the partner.
Right, because thinking about this in the extreme, if the United States literally cared zero about Eastern Europe, then the optimal amount of effort to put into the defense of Eastern Europe is correspondingly zero.
Yes, and if we keep thinking through this logic, we can think through one of the possible downsides of a troop withdrawal. Imagine that the U.S. withdrawed troops. Well, what inference might Russia make from that? Drawing in this logic, you can see that Russia may infer that the U.S. is no longer committed because they're unwilling to shoulder those costs, and this might weaken deterrence and increase the probability of a Russian attack. So ultimately, this is an example of there not being a free lunch. So in a world where the U.S. could save on the cost of these deployments without changing Russia's assessment of U.S. credibility of the security guarantee to the NATO partners, it might be worth it to do that. The issue is that withdrawing the troops risks having Russia draw the wrong signal. So this presents the U.S. with a trade-off. By shouldering these upfront costs of maintaining troop deployments, the U.S. might save on the ultimately much larger cost of having Russia attack a partner and then the U.S. having to decide how to support them in a war.
Well, let me present to you what the Trump administration's argument ultimately is going to be here. Russia is not in a position to threaten Eastern Europe right now, and I know that sounds a little bit weird the first time you hear this because there's an ongoing war in Ukraine, but by virtue of having fought that war in Ukraine, and as long as that war is continuing, there is going to have to be a long period after it ends, whenever it ends, for Russia to be able to regroup and be able to actually have some sort of real threat of invasion along the NATO eastern flank. Essentially, Russia has only so many resources, and Russia has put so many eggs into the Ukraine basket that trying to attack the eastern flank right now is not a plausible thing in the next few years. And given that simultaneously, in the other part of the world known as the Indo-Pacific, there is a much more credible threat currently of China attacking Taiwan, why doesn't the United States try to refocus all of its efforts to doing that now? And then maybe later on, years from now, when Russia has either withdrawn from Ukraine or there has been some sort of long settled line of control that is not going to be easily contested, and Russia is able to redeploy to areas more north of where the current line of control is in Ukraine, maybe that's the time for the United States to come back into Europe.
If you proceed from the premise that Russia, by virtue of being tied up in Ukraine, is not an active threat to NATO members currently, then yes, I think it follows that troop withdrawal would not serve to undermine these deterrent benefits, because if Russia can't attack, there is no one to be deterred. But that doesn't mean that a withdrawal or reallocation of U.S. troops to Asia doesn't have any downsides. And we can see that by returning to the first two benefits I mentioned, which are both things that accrue in the long run. Right? So if the U.S. withdraws its troops and they're no longer working to achieve interoperability with NATO partners in Europe, that is going to be difficult to get back up to speed years down the road. And the same for these effects on public and elite opinion. It may be difficult to reestablish those positive benefits that the U.S. is accruing if we draw down and let those things degrade. So I think starting from the premise that Russia is tied up and it might be worth it to sort of borrow against the future by reallocating troops to Asia, I also think that thinking about these long-term considerations in terms of interoperability and the political benefits of deployments, if that's not a part of the conversation, I think we're having the wrong conversation.
Well, Brad, this is the second time that you've been on one of these. Why don't you just conclude by saying something that you want to talk about, maybe death metal?
Wait, do you want this podcast to be 2 hours long?
No, you have about 15 seconds. One, because I know nothing about this subject matter, and two, because I don't want to completely tank my retention metrics.
Okay, I'll keep it brief. I'll actually make an album recommendation. So I think one of the best death metal albums that's come out probably in the last 10 years came out a couple weeks ago. It's a self-titled album from the band Rivers of Nihil. I have 3 selling points. One is that they are from your current home state of Pennsylvania.
It's actually a Commonwealth.
Oh, fine. Okay. Yeah, sure. Two is that the album, strangely, was inspired by Phil Collins' era Genesis, which is a really weird influence for a death metal album. And the third is that it prominently features saxophone. So do with that information what you will.
Well, that was 40 seconds long, so now that my retention metrics have been completely trashed, I want to briefly say thank you again to Brad for joining me today. And if you enjoyed listening to this interview, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.